All right, students, it's Taurus back again. Today, we are looking at figures of speech and literary devices, analyzing the manipulation of language, part 2. Okay, so figures of speech, literary devices, also known as poetic devices. Okay, these are going to be our similes, our metaphors, our different allusions, pieces of repetition, those kind of devices that you may be or should be familiar with from your previous years of school, okay? We're going to be definitely looking for pieces of imagery and other literary devices. However, we're not going to be completing a what, how, why response. We're going to be completing a D2M. Excuse me. So let's go ahead and jump in to Whoso Lists to Hunt by Sir Thomas Wyatt. Of course, I'm going to begin by numbering the lines in the poem. I'm going to map out our major units of division. So there's my octave and there's my sestet. And then I'm also going to mark where the volta occurs. And the reason that I'm doing this is because later, whenever I speak about, whenever I speak about these poetic devices, it's beneficial for me and for the reader to be able to identify where within the poem these devices occur. So if this occurs in the octave, in the sestet, on what line this occurs, this just enables me to speak a little bit more clearly about that, okay? So we looked at a paraphrase of this poem a couple of videos ago, and we talked about this poem literally being about a man telling his friends, hey, if you want to hunt a deer, I know where to find a deer, but trust me, this deer cannot be had. I've tried hunting this deer. I cannot catch this deer. And we talked about the poem being literally about a deer, but figuratively, what is he talking about? So we talked about how this is poetry, and poetry is the language of love. And when we kind of get on that logical train, we arrived at the fact that the poem is talking about a hunt, but the hunt is actually a chase for a woman. So we have what we identified earlier as a metaphor, but an extended metaphor. Okay, so that's going to be our first and most prevalent piece of literary devices. Okay, so we have here an extended metaphor. An extended metaphor is also sometimes called a conceit. But an extended metaphor, it is, okay? And so here I'm just going to lay that out, just take some brief notes, okay? So the extended metaphor is the hunt with the speaker as the hunter. The hind, which is the deer, is the woman. Actually, let me put the woman in parentheses. So the hind is the woman he is pursuing on this hunt. It is clear from the beginning of the poem that this is it's kind of like a game. This is a game he cannot win. And we know this because whenever we paraphrase, we notice that here it says, the vain travail hath wearied me so sore, I am of them the furthest that come behind. Okay, so this has made me tired, it's made me exhausted, this hunt. Of all the hunters there are, I am in very last place. So this is something that he cannot win. We'll also notice, so there's our extended metaphor, and I'm going to take my my highlighter. I'm going to highlight that yellow over here in my notes, and I'm just going to kind of highlight the word hunt briefly in the poem. Now, you may be tempted to highlight like the entire poem because it's an extended metaphor that runs through the entire thing, but that's going to get messy. And my advice for annotating is if you're going to highlight everything, then you might as well not highlight anything because not everything is important. And I'm meaning like everything the same color. Keep it as clean as possible whenever you're making your annotations. So the next thing that I'm going to look for in the poem is repetition, okay? And repetition is one of those things that's pretty easy to identify, especially repetition of words. If we look here, we can see that he's using the word vain here. And then he uses the word vain elsewhere in the poem. In the sestet, he uses the word vain again. So we do have some repetition. And we have repetition of a couple of words, and we'll talk about those words, okay? And so we also have repetition of the word wearied. So the hunt has wearied me so sore, and I have a wearied mind. So I'm just going to go over here. So we have repetition of vain, lines 3, and that's the weirdest and symbol I've ever drawn in my life. 3 and 10. Then we have wearied in lines 3 and 5. All right, and so we're not necessarily analyzing these right now. We're just mapping them out, taking our notes. Where do these things occur? One other thing that we noticed, one thing that may have made your paraphrase of this poem a little bit difficult is there's some figures of speech that may have seemed odd to you at first. So if we look in line 8, I'm going to go ahead and highlight this portion here in line 8 when he says, since in a net I seek to hold the wind. And if you remember, whenever we paraphrased, where he says, since in a net I seek to hold the wind, we identified that as an idiom. So this is a figure of speech. It is a phrase that should not be taken literally. It's a phrase that it's a turn of phrase, okay? So here we're going to identify the idiom, and we're going to say we have since in a net I seek to hold the wind. And this here is where he stops his hunt because it is an impossible task. Remember, we discussed if you can hold the wind in a net, and you cannot. Now we're also going to locate it, and this occurs at the volta in line 8. So this is one reason why it's important to map out the major units of division in your poem, because then you can locate things on their lines and near important boundaries. And we'll talk about important boundaries when we talk about diction. As we move forward through the poem, we'll notice we have this Latin phrase here, noli me tangere, for Caesar's I am. And this Latin phrase here, you would have to maybe do a little bit of research, right? But whenever we paraphrased here, we said that this phrase means, do not touch me because I belong to the king. And whenever we finished paraphrasing, we went back and we looked at the 5 W's, the who, what, when, where, and why. Okay? And so here we talked about how the author of a poem is rarely the speaker or the narrator of the poem. But in some cases, biographical information about the author ends up in the poem. And that seems to be the case here with Whoso Lists to Hunt, because whenever you do some research about Sir Thomas Wyatt, you find that he had a relationship with a woman who could not be had, who was dangerous to deal with. And that woman's name was Anne Boleyn. And the reason that she was dangerous to deal with is because she was one of the wives of King Henry VIII. And so we can go down here and we can use that to talk about this allusion for Caesar's I am. And so here we can say that this is an allusion. All right. And we'll put this in line 13. And then we'll say that this is an allusion to King Henry VIII. And again, you might have to be a little bit versed in history or do a little bit of research. But one of the main reasons that we can determine that this is a strong allusion to King Henry VIII is because this deer has around its neck this diamond kind of collar. And King Henry VIII was known for gifting his mistresses diamond necklaces. So this deer that wears this collar around its neck that says in diamonds, I belong to the king. Well, when you think about circled the wrong thing. When you think about something around its neck, you think about a collar, for an animal like a deer. But if you think about a person, you would think about a necklace. And when you think about a necklace with diamonds associated with a person that Sir Thomas Wyatt tried to have a relationship with, but that was dangerous. And then we get to Anne Boleyn and we get to King Henry VIII. This is also an allusion to the Bible. This same phrase here, noli me tangere. This is also a biblical allusion. To Christ, actually. Okay. So Christ said to his disciples, "Do not touch me, for I have not yet ascended." Now, one thing about this biblical allusion and allusions to Christ and Christianity is what is very helpful in this class, because we read majority European and American pieces of literature. You have to think about the role that religion plays in people's lives. And for people who are religious or people who are brought up as religious, that is a major factor in their lives. Whether good or bad. And people tend to put references to major factors in their lives. So in European and American literature, since Christianity, some form of Christianity, plays such a huge role in people's lives, it inevitably ends up in the literature. So if you are knowledgeable about biblical stories, especially Christian biblical stories, this class will be a little bit easier for you, because you will be able to pick up on those allusions. Within this allusion, we also have a couple of other pieces of literary devices. So the collar around this deer's neck, this is going to be a symbol. Okay, so a symbol is a physical item that one can hold in their hand that represents an idea. And so the collar on the deer's neck is a symbol of, and I want you to think about animals. So this deer says, "I am wild," okay? But when you think about animals and the types of animals that you put collars on, you would put a collar on an animal that you own. So the collar around the deer's neck is a symbol of ownership. This deer, who is a person, belongs to somebody else. He does not belong to you. Okay, so the collar, the necklace, is a symbol of ownership, because it can be seen as a form of property. We also have some visual imagery here in diamonds. Okay. The visual imagery of the diamonds around the deer's neck. And that is what kind of led us to the allusion to Anne Boleyn. So, as you can see, when we take this piece by piece, and we just go, line by line, wherever we see these things, we just go and we check off these boxes of these things that we're happening to see, okay? Now, these pieces of figurative language, they will not be in every single poem. but every poem will have something, okay? I'm not saying that you're going to find this, and this in every single poem, but most poems, every poem is going to have something. There's going to be some imagery. There may be an allusion. There's going to be some kind of metaphor. There's going to be some kind of symbolism. And we have to think logically about how to break these things down to make meaning out of them. So what we're going to do here now is we're going to look at one of these pieces of figurative language. And we're just going to write a D2M. And a D2M is going to be a device to meaning explanation, okay? This is going to be where we explain how this device helps to create meaning within this poem, okay? And this is our bread and butter of this class, okay? We're going to be doing D2Ms all year long. This is a skill that needs to be developed. This is where we talk about little idea and big idea. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to choose the extended metaphor. And the reason I'm choosing the extended metaphor for this particular D2M is because it encompasses the entire poem. Okay, so it gives me, in a short amount of time, a good opportunity to talk about as much of the poem as possible. Now, I can write a D2M about every single one of these pieces, all right? And when you see figurative language in poetry this year in class, you will be tasked with writing D2Ms about multiple pieces of figurative language. I'm just writing about this one now as an example for you. So I'm going to say, in Whoso Lists to Hunt, Sir Thomas Wyatt builds an extended metaphor of a hunter fruitlessly, and fruitlessly is, doing something in vain, fruitlessly chasing a deer that he cannot catch. He establishes the metaphor in the first line. So this is, again, why it's important that we number our lines and mark our units of division so that we can discuss where in the poem this happens. That keeps us organized in our writing, but it also makes it easy for the reader to follow our thought process. So he establishes the metaphor in the first line, connecting the hunt to the hind through a piece of alliteration. So you'll notice, and this is pretty unique to an extended metaphor, especially one that encompasses the entire poem. You'll notice that as I am talking about one device, since it encompasses the entirety of the poem, I can also then talk about other devices as well. Okay, this extended metaphor is the umbrella, and so it captures everything under it. And so under that umbrella, I can talk about alliteration, I can talk about consonants, I can talk about the other devices that I've found. I can reference them briefly, or I can explain them a little bit more. And when you do that, this actually builds you up to what we call the sophistication point on the AP exam. And sophistication is just where you take something. You can get the sophistication point by taking what you are analyzing and talking about it by looking at all angles in a complete 360-degree 4D view. You pick it up and you look at it from all sides and you explain it from all sides. So through a piece of alliteration, which is mirrored, after the volta with her and hunt. So that happens when he says, who list her hunt. So that same HH alliteration that we found up here is also found down here, and it's mirrored there. The reality that this hunt is a fruitless endeavor is emphasized, or I can say is then emphasized, because I'm moving on to a different literary device. By the idiom of attempting to hold the wind in a net. I'm just going to put a little dash here, an impossible task, period. So this is my D2M talking about the extended metaphor. But again, and this might confuse you a little bit, because within the D2M where I'm talking about the extended metaphor, I'm also mentioning alliteration with hunt, hind, her, and hunt. And then I'm also mentioning an idiom about attempting to hold the wind in a net. But the reason I'm doing that is because an extended metaphor is an umbrella. It covers the entire poem. And so underneath that umbrella is the repetition, the idiom, the allusion, the symbol, the visual imagery. So I can talk about it like that. If I were only talking about repetition, then I might not have to bring in the idiom. I might not have to bring in the allusion. I can just talk about the repetition. Okay? So that is a little bit of a dive into figures of speech and literary devices. Again, we didn't read this top part, but this top part is very, very important. So poetry is a compact language. I want you to think about it like frozen orange juice you might get in the freezer at H-E-B or Kroger, okay? You need to understand that the words in poems are doing double duty, okay? They are doing so much, especially in a sonnet. A sonnet is 14 lines of 10 syllables. This poet has 140 syllables to make meaning, okay? You say 140 syllables very quickly when you speak, probably within 2 to 3 sentences. And this poet needs to say so much in so little space. And so these words have to do double duty. And that's why figures of speech are important, because not only do they help set up the story, which we identified in the paraphrase, not only do they give us information about who, what, when, where, why, but then they tell us exactly what the poet is thinking over here, okay? So that was figures of speech. You will now practice this with One Day I Wrote Her Name Upon the Strand. Again, you will find different figures of speech in there, but practice this with One Day, and then we will, in class, practice together with Sonnet 116. See you later.